And so based on the variables that we had access to in the database and then the equations that we obtained, we were able to better hypothesize on those factors that affect both apparent ruminal synthesis and duodenal flow.
Welcome to Rumination, the podcast that offers practical solutions to the challenges in our industry. I am Chris Gwynn, your host today, and today I'm really excited to be talking with Vicki Brisson. Vicki is an MSc candidate, finishing up this spring, right, Vicki, at the University of Guelph in Canada. Her area of research is one that's of keen interest to many, and in particular to Jefo nutrition, because it's all about what impacts B vitamin synthesis by the rumen microbiota. Vicki grew up in Eastern Ontario. She was, like many of us, a 4-H member, which led her into her passion and love for animal science, which took her to a degree in Guelph and then a master's. And she spent her summers around cows, working on several nutrition and management projects at the farm level. And in September of 2021, Jefo welcomed Vicki with open arms. And she is now a full-time employee working at Jefo. We look for a long and lengthy career with her as a member of our technical team. So, Vicki, welcome to Rumination.
Thanks, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
So often it's enjoyable and interesting to talk about our journeys. And I'd love to hear, and the audience would, about your journey to your current role, and then maybe a touch on the research that you've been doing in your master's.
Absolutely. So I think you've done a great introduction, so I might repeat myself a little, but as you mentioned, I grew up on a dairy farm and I really had an interest for animal health. So starting in grade 8 until probably the beginning of my master's, I spent lots of time shadowing large animal vets. They were probably tired of me by the end, but I'd say that it really allowed me to not only deepen my knowledge of animal health and key challenges that the producers face, but also to learn how to establish meaningful relationships and collaborate with the key players that make up a farmer's support team, whether that be the nutritionist, the vet, the banker, etc. And that's really what I love about the dairy industry in specific. And so from there, I decided to complete my BSc AGR, as you mentioned, at the University of Guelph. And I think, like lots of people going into animal science, my initial goal was to pursue a career in veterinary medicine. However, I think I found the right path when I discovered a special interest for the role of nutrition and how it can have an impact on animal health. So after completing a dairy sales internship with Cargill Animal Nutrition in the summer of 2019, I started my master's degree with Dr. Jen Ellis at the University of Guelph. I was really looking forward to the challenge that my thesis project would be and where it could lead. But I was also completely stepping into a new area of animal nutrition for me. Since starting my master's, I've done a deep dive into both mathematical modeling and the importance of B vitamins for dairy cows. And when I say a deep dive, it's because really, we have maybe one course on animal nutrition in undergrad, and then you go off into the world. So when I was presented with this possible master's project, I just said, why not? Let's get into it. And since then, my curiosity about these topics just keep growing. It really feels like we've only touched the tip of the iceberg here. So that's why I'm just so keen on the work that I've done in my master's. And that's really what led me to my job at Jefo. I really could see the potential that there is to develop work on B vitamins. And through my master's, I really saw, the potential impact it can have on dairy cows and just dairy production overall. So this is where I am. This is what I do.
Oh, that's great. And it's great to hear that we all have different journeys. So many of them start with, I want to be a vet, right? So I figured out within about 3 months of my first year that I didn't know how to study, so that I had to change directions there. And a big shout out to Dr. Mike Steele teaching that one nutrition course, right? We wouldn't want to miss out on that. It's a good course. And so thank you for expanding on that. And I think it helps a lot of listeners appreciate the journey that you've had, and it mimics perhaps some of the journey that they have. So speaking of B vitamins and the research that you worked on, can you expand a bit more on what you found to date?
Absolutely. So my research was really twofold. So let me just dig into a bit more of the structure and how I approached it. So the first objective was really to develop empirical models. So empirical models are a set of equations, but it's really more of a static model. It describes or summarizes data. So we summarized results of a meta-analysis that we conducted using previously collected data from 16 previously published studies. And that allowed us to determine what dietary and ruminal factors were most likely to drive the observed apparent ruminal synthesis and then the duodenal flow of B vitamins. And so the duodenal flow here really represents the supply of B vitamins to the cow. And so that's why it's important to understand how those B vitamins are synthesized and then what is available to the cow. Because unlike in monogastrics, what is available in the diet isn't necessarily, and actually it's not equal to what is available to the cow. There is this rumen black box that is still a mystery to many of us. I'd say to most of us, that is an interesting area of research. But we still have so much to discover about it. And so based on the variables that we had access to in the database and then the equations that we obtained, we were able to better hypothesize on those factors that affect both apparent ruminal synthesis and duodenal flow. So we really developed two separate sets of equations because, really focusing on the rumen and then focusing on the supply to the cow, rather than trying to merge them all as one. And so these equations also highlighted that the apparent ruminal synthesis of each single B vitamin is affected by different factors in different ways. So what often happens is we just talk about B vitamins at large. And our equations here really highlighted that, while in a supplement, that is definitely what happens, to better understand how those vitamins are synthesized in the rumen, we need to consider them individually in order to better account for, how do they interact? Because there's also that aspect of synergies and interactions between all of the vitamins. So we need to consider them both individually and then as a group. So it's kind of a complex nutrient to look at, but definitely an interesting one. And then so from that insight that we gained, the second objective of my project was really to develop a mechanistic model to predict the supply of B12 to the cow. And so that model was really developed on the hypothetical assumptions that we made based on the empirical models. And so mechanistic models, due to their dynamic nature, really allow us to make predictions on the effect that changing diet factors will have. And when we change diet factors, we impact the rumen environment. And when we change the rumen environment, we change the availability of B12 to the cow. So that's why we want to play with, what happens if we increase forage in the diet, if we increase starch in the diet, if we increase the percentage of digestible NDF versus undigestible NDF. And so at the current time being, it's really being more used as a tool to guide future research rather than commercial use. It's really allowing us to just define how we want to establish future research rather than, go out and do lots of trials and not necessarily collect the data that we need. It allows us to identify those knowledge gaps and then move on with our research in a more efficient way.
No, fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. So you talked about some of the influences. So what are some of the drivers to B vitamin synthesis? If we look at them as a whole, and maybe in particular you researched more in depth in B12, but it would really be interesting to know if there was some common drivers in particular of B vitamin synthesis that we can share with the audience.
Absolutely. So I will start out by saying that, there's still a lot that's being studied when it comes to the ruminal synthesis of B vitamins. So I won't go out on a limb and make assumptions that, haven't been confirmed yet. But over the last few years, many studies, including a meta-analysis that contain, with 50 herds of Holstein cows over 45 days in milk, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, has demonstrated that positive milk production response to rumen-protected B vitamin supplements. And so that really, justifies that, yes, there is something happening here in the rumen. There are factors that affect how much B vitamin is reaching the cow's duodenum. But what does that tell us? And that's something I haven't touched on in our discussions so far, but, while we know that the rumen's microbes can't synthesize B vitamins, that response to supplementation really indicates that the rumen microbes probably don't produce enough B vitamins to support the cow's needs. And so if their needs were met by ruminal synthesis, we wouldn't be seeing this kind of effect throughout. So to go back to your question, the short answer is it depends. We need to remember, as I've mentioned previously, that every B vitamin is different. But your question was, what are those key drivers that are constant throughout or that can link all of the B vitamins together? And so that would really be, my first answer to that would be dry matter intake. In our empirical models, we use dry matter intake as a scalar variable because we know that dry matter intake, as I've mentioned previously, affects the rumen microbial population. If we have a greater dry matter intake, that affects the rate of passage, that affects the diversity of our rumen microbial population. Will we have more microbes digesting starch? Will we have more microbes digesting fiber? And so this is really where dry matter intake comes in. So it was included in all of the models for all of the B vitamins. But what was interesting was that dry matter intake actually had opposite effects on different B vitamins. So when we decreased dry matter intake, it led in a decrease of riboflavin, thiamine, and vitamin B6. However, when we decreased dry matter intake, it also increased the synthesis of niacin, folates, and B12. So we have a few hypotheses here. These have yet to be confirmed. Most likely, as I've mentioned previously, it is most likely due to just shifts in those rumen microbial populations that either synthesize or degrade the vitamins. So if we see a decrease in the apparent ruminal synthesis, that could either mean that we have less bacteria that are synthesizing the vitamins, or it could mean that we have more bacteria that are using those vitamins. But we have no way of quantifying or of defining that yet. So this is where kind of our knowledge or our findings stop. But it's also interesting and super motivating because there is just so much more potential for research in that field. Another key driver was really when it comes to digestible starch and digestible NDF. And once again, those affect the apparent ruminal synthesis and the resulting supply to the cow in different ways. So, really here I'll be shifting to the way when we analyze those results, we really looked at, what does this mean when we're trying to figure out which of the cellulolytic microbes or the amylolytic microbes synthesize each vitamin. This was kind of our way to clean out maybe the results that we were looking at or to simplify it. And so from these findings and the effect of digestible starch and digestible NDF on the synthesis and the resulting supply to the cow, our hypothesis thus far is that cellulolytic microbes, or the microbes that digest fiber, are likely to synthesize riboflavin as well as vitamin B12 or cobalamin, whereas amylolytic microbes, or microbes that digest starch, are likely to be synthesizing thiamine, niacin, vitamin B6, as well as folates. With that being said, however, and I know you had Dr. Christiane Girard on your podcast earlier, and she talked a lot about, the importance of B12 and B9 and how we need to have an adequate supply of both, and having a limited supply of either B9 or B12 can result in a secondary deficiency in the other one. So what does that mean in the context of our possible findings here? Well, we have one type of bacteria that is synthesizing B12. We have another type of bacteria that is synthesizing folates, but those go in opposite effects. So, if we really want to focus on the effect of diet on apparent ruminal synthesis, we'll need to kind of find that sweet spot so that we're not favoring B12 and then having insufficient supply of folates. And I think, while we figure all of this out, this is where really the rumen-protected B vitamin supplementation is interesting, because we're just bypassing those ruminal factors and we're helping the cow just have all of her metabolic needs met, or just ensure that the metabolic machine is well oiled and functioning properly to meet kind of needs that are, associated to production, to repro, to health and all of that. So I hope that answers your question.
No, it does. It's obviously not simplistic. It's biology, it's physiology, it's metabolism. It's complicated, but as it pointed out, numerous studies has shown responses. So in the absence of all the fine and minute data that we don't have, that we will have over the next 5, 10, and 15 years, there's strategies that we can implement today. So I thank you for that clarity and bringing forth the take-home messages from your research. So on that point, I always like to end a podcast with some of the practical take-home messages for producers, for nutritionists and veterinarians. And so looking back at your research, what would be some of the key points that you would really remind people to focus on?
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest thing, and if we talk to Dr. Christiane Girard, she will mention this over and over again, but we know that B vitamins are essential coenzymes to support the cow's metabolic needs. And we know that, whether it be a cow that's stressed during transition, during heat stress, that's just, at her peak lactation, we need to support those metabolic needs. We're still studying the factors that affect the apparent ruminal synthesis and the resulting supply of individual B vitamins to cow. But we know that dry matter intake, digestible starch, and digestible NDF are likely key drivers. We're still trying to define that mode of action, but those key drivers keep coming out over and over again. Until we know more on these modes of actions, however, as I've mentioned previously, the positive production, reproduction, and health responses to supplementation, which represents just a direct increased supply, have been widely demonstrated. And they suggest that the cow's needs for B vitamins simply cannot be met only through ruminal synthesis. And so those cows need a bit of help, and they need B vitamin supplementation.
No, great points, and thank you for summarizing. And we look forward to further engagement and discussion on this subject. So thank you very much, Vicki.
Thank you, Chris, for having me.
And thank you for the audience, and thank you to Vicki for sharing your time and investing your time on the Rumination podcast. And so that you don't miss this episode and future episodes, you can find us at the Jefo website on jefo.ca, on Apple and Google Podcasts, as well as Spotify. As noted, this podcast was brought to you by Jefo Nutrition, precision nutrition for a growing world. And have a great day.